Hello everyone. So we'll make a start on this week's tutorial session. So I think the sort of area that we're going to look at this week is the creation of simple animations using Creo, because that is one of the requirements of your project work, to create a simple animation to kind of showcase a product, do a little assembly explode to show all the individual pieces that go into an assembly. And then maybe play around with some camera angles in terms of what direction you're viewing your part from. So we're going to be looking at some of the tools that you would use in Creo to achieve that. But essentially, what we're looking to create as an output from that activity is some kind of video file. So Creo can output video files in probably two of the most common formats, which is MPEG format. It's a little bit behind the times in that it outputs them as MPEG 2 rather than MPEG 4. But you can also output them as AVI files, which is a common Windows format for video files. And then if you have some conversion software, such as some of the free software that's out there on the internet is quite good. There's a video conversion software called Handbrake that you can download for free. You can then take that AVI file and squash it down to a reasonable size that you can transmit it over the internet without having to wait a long time to download it. But essentially, we're looking to create a video file as our output in one of these common formats that you can then exchange with other people, or upload to YouTube, or embed on your company website, say. But that's our ultimate goal. So I've got just such a animation file that I've already created with the parts and the assembly that we're going to use in this session. So that's on my screen now. So you can see I've named that motor MPEG. And if I play that just in Windows here, you can see various things are happening. So the assembly's exploding, the camera angle's moving slightly, it's pausing for a second, then it's moving again to kind of showcase all the different parts in there and give the viewer an appreciation of them. Then it's coming back together, so it's unexploding, if you want to use that term. And then the camera angle changes again after a short pause. And then I think towards the end of the longer animation that we will take a look at in a minute, the actual transparency of the case becomes modified. So we'll look at methods of how you can do that as well, where you can make certain components in the assembly semi-transparent, so you can actually see other components that are hidden by them normally. And then you can make those components return to being fully opaque, so non-transparent. So we're going to look at a few of the tools that Creo offers you to do these simple transitions from either a viewing position to a different viewing position, or from an unexploded assembly to an exploded assembly, or from opaque parts to transparent parts. So there's three main tool sets that we can use there to kind of achieve these sorts of animations. I'm just looking in the chat. Someone's asking about the submission deadline. Blah, 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 coursework on the module homepage. It says 29th of April, but submission box says 6th of May. Ah, that's interesting. I would go with the submission box. So I've set that up as the 6th of May to the best of my sort of recollection. But I will double check that for you. But I would work to the 6th of May because that system is kind of automated as to whether the system regards you as having handed it in late or on time. And I've told the system via the submission box date that it will be the 6th of May. So work to the 6th of May. I'm happy for you to do that. So back to what we were going to do. So the thing that you need to download initially is this zip file at the bottom there, because we're going to tackle animation first. And then if we manage to run through everything that I want to do on the animation side in this session, we're then going to have a little look at some of the rendering tools within Creo. So computer graphics or computer-based rendering techniques allow you to create a somewhat realistic view of your part. So that is, you can apply textures to the part, you can map image files onto the background, you can create virtual lights to actually light the part, various tools to try and create varying degrees of realism. Now, the only kind of limit to that is how much time you're willing to put into it. So just as an example, I was playing around earlier with the Creo rendering package, and within about 5 minutes, I sort of rendered out this part, which isn't fabulous. The realism's got a lot to be desired on this, but you get the idea. We'll have a little play around with the rendering tools within Creo. We'll talk about some of their limitations, some of the things that they do well, little tricks and tips that you can use to actually kind of bump the realism of your scene up a little bit. But essentially, the rendering tools within Creo allow you to create these more realistic views of your parts. So yeah, we'll tackle that. And as I say, when we get to that, we'll kind of, I'll give you some comment on how the Creo rendering tools work, and the fact that they are actually cut down versions of full professional programs that have been included with Creo. And I'll give you a bit of a pointer in terms of if you want to check out some of those fully featured programs, where you would get them from and what they're called. So yeah, we'll do rendering in the second half of this session, but we'll tackle the animation side of things first. I'm just flicking backwards and forwards between the chat and what I'm talking about here. Yeah, so it looks like maybe some of the other modules, the dates are a little bit confused as well. But yeah, we'll work to the 6th. I don't mind committing to that at this point, so don't worry about that. Work to the 6th. So you want to download that zip file. You want to unzip that zip file. Just as a little side note, I believe the animation tools that we're about to use are available in the student version. So if you wanted to, you could probably run the local version if you've got it. But they are definitely available in the remote desktop version, because that's what I've kind of checked earlier today, just to check that they're all available in there. So you want to download that zip file. You want to unzip that zip file into a folder that's probably going to call itself whatever the zip file's called, animation creo5.zip. And then you want to set that folder as your working directory as you come into Creo, or as you boot Creo up. And then when you get in there, so I'll just close mine down temporarily so I can load it in just the same as you. You'll click on open, it will browse into your working directory. There'll be various files in there that we may reuse some of these when we tackle drawings, but we're not going to do that in this session. But the one that you want to load in is the motor ASM, so the motor assembly, and then that will load in this assembly of parts that is some form of motor. I think it's from a desk fan, actually. So you can imagine the blades of the fan attached to this end of it, and it sort of oscillates backwards and forwards. So yeah, this is one of the assemblies that are included with the PTC training material that you get. So if you'd designed your own assembly, let's say, for example, your craft knife, you'd taken a save of the assembly, you were then ready to create one of these sort of showcase animations to try and show someone how the assembly worked or what parts were inside it. You'd load the assembly in initially, and then you go to Applications, so the Applications tab there, click on Animation, and then it would take you through into a new interface. So you can see there's a new tab that's appeared at the top there that's called animation, and it's got all our tools that we're going to use for our animation. Now, the one that you're looking at, I don't think it's got this pre-built animation in there. So I've pre-built an animation that we're going to have a little look at now before we try and replicate some of the things that are in there. So just let me activate the animation that I'm interested in. So what I have to do first there is I have to let the system calculate what this animation is going to look like. So I've already done the work to set this animation up, but every time I load this assembly up, I've got to let the system recalculate what all these frames of animation are actually going to appear like. So you can see it's kind of running through that animation, it's calculating it. This is a relatively long one, it's 40 seconds long. And what we're going to do as our sort of guide is we're going to try and replicate all the steps that are in this animation that I've got on my screen. So let me just play that back. That's if my system doesn't crash. So there's various things. What I'm going to do is I'm going to keep stopping this. So initially, nothing's kind of changed other than the positions of some of the parts there. So if you saw, the angle that we're viewing the scene from is the same. We get to 2 seconds here, it's still the same. 3 seconds, it's still the same, but the parts are beginning to explode apart. So there's an explode event happening, which is the first thing on our timeline that's occurring. So then we'll transition a bit further. That explode's still happening. And then at this point, at 6 seconds, the view begins to change. So the viewpoint that we're actually viewing the part from, the camera, if you like, its position is beginning to change. And then as we keep going, it changes further. Now, the explode's finished at this point. So the explode is concluded by either 5 or 6 seconds because the parts are no longer moving away from each other. It's purely the viewpoint that's rotating around the part now. Still rotating. Oh, something else happened there. So between those two frames, that frame there at 5 seconds and that frame there at 6 seconds, it's not immediately obvious, but the transparency of these end caps is beginning to become more transparent. Initially, they were opaque white surfaces. You couldn't see through them at all. And they're beginning to become more and more transparent. We'll see that as the camera transitions round, so we're looking through one of them at the actual motor there. We'll be able to see the motor through this, so we'll appreciate that it is becoming more transparent. There you go. So there's 3 things happening. Well, the explode's already happened, it's concluded. The viewpoint is moving, and the transparency of certain parts within the scene is changing. And then we run forward a little bit further. We have a pause. This is often good if you're trying to create an animation that you want to share with someone. It's a bit disorientating to have the camera constantly moving with no pauses in between. So the viewer inevitably needs a little sort of time just to appreciate, right, okay, I can take in what this 3D shape is that I'm looking at. Whereas if it's in constant motion, it's a lot more difficult to appreciate. So there's a pause in the whole thing. There's not anything happening between 10 and 11 seconds. Then we get to 12 seconds, the view begins to change again to a third type of view. Again, everything's static in terms of its exploded position. The position of the parts relative to each other isn't changing, but our camera viewpoint is changing. So we're rotating round to a slightly different view. Now things are starting to come back together. So between those 2 frames, the explode event is beginning to reverse itself. So the parts are beginning to come back together again. And there they go. And again, the viewpoint or the camera position is static. And again, that's to allow the viewer to kind of appreciate, oh, right, the parts are actually coming back together now, rather than being confused by the fact that the camera's moving and the parts are moving relative to each other as well. So now they come back together. The camera, having paused for a second or two, starts to move again. I think we're going back to the original sort of camera angle. And now the transparency begins to reverse. You can see the parts are becoming slightly more opaque there on that sort of frame jump. And then just because I was trying to relate this as closely as possible to what you've been tasked with in your project. And one of the tasks is not only do an explode of the entire knife assembly, but also illustrate the blade assembly moving in and out, as a user might slide the blade out and then slide the blade back in. So this is sort of analogous to that. So what I'm doing is I'm just picking a single component off the front and I'm just shifting it out to a position and then bringing it back in again. So if you can do that using this assembly, you can apply those skills to your knife when you come to this point to actually create an animation of your knife. So that's kind of, there's a lot of things happening there, but the method that we set them up is just blocks, building blocks, one on top of the other, on top of the other. There's nothing terribly complicated. So the next thing that we're going to look at before we jump in to actually creating one of these ourselves is we can see the interface at the top here. We have a timeline from 0 seconds to however many seconds we want our animation to run for. And then we have what are known as keyframe events, or keyframe sequences is actually the term that Creo uses. But essentially, we tell the system, for example, I want the transparency to be 100% opaque at 0 seconds. And then I want to transition to a still 100% opaque. So you can see the slider there is down at opaque rather than up at clear. But then from this point here to this point here on the timeline, I want to transition to a semi-transparent state. So you can see this is slid to 66%, 100% being a clear component and 0% being a fully opaque component. And that is assigned to a certain second on the timeline. So you can see the time that occurs is 7. So the system will transition from fully opaque to that semi-transparent state over that time period. So we do this sort of keyframe sequence setup with all 3 elements, either the exploded state of our assembly, so unexploded to exploded, the actual camera angle that we're viewing the scene from, so initial camera there, and then we have, let's see if I can get one of these to activate. So there's the second camera angle. Where's the third one? There's the third one, round there. So it's a pretty simple concept. You put these keyframes in and the system does what's known as interpolation between the 2 events, and it smoothly transitions from one to the other. And then the bottom line there governs the explode state of the part. So you can see that it's fully exploded at this point, it's completely unexploded at that point, and the system fills in the intervening animation frames between those 2 events. So that's kind of broadly how we build these animations up. So let's jump in and actually try and replicate what I've got on my screen here. So the first thing that we're going to do, so you should have either just one animation here. Can someone just chip in? Do you have animation 1 already there? I think you should have. Yeah. So given that you have a single animation there, you don't have any other option but to have that animation active, whereas I've already got 2 and I actually want to create a third one, which is the one that I'm going to show you how to create this animation afresh. But if I right click at the top of that tree, I can go to new and I can create however many animations I want. And kind of pays in this kind of setup to tell the system that we're going to be creating an explode sequence within this animation. So you want to go new, explode animation. You can give it a name then if you want to give it a specific name. I'm just going to leave mine with the just default name of animation 3. As I say, you'll be editing animation 1, so you won't have to do this. But if in the future you want to create an assembly that has multiple animations stored within a single assembly, this is how you would do that. So that step that I've just done there, you don't have to do. So what should we do first? Well, before we create our exploded sequence in here, which is what we're going to do first, we actually have to temporarily jump out of animation mode to define what's known as an exploded state. So every assembly that we create, we can define the positions of the parts within that assembly in an exploded state. And you can use these exploded states on drawings. You've probably seen them a lot on assembly drawings. You have an exploded assembly, possibly with some balloons with numbers attached to each component. And then you tend to have a table at the side, which is known as a bill of materials. And the bill of materials has, in its first column, a series of numbers that correspond to the balloons that are attached to the components in the drawing. So creating exploded states isn't just applicable to assemblies. You use it in drawings as well. And often if you're going to share your files in some kind of transmissible 3D format, like 3D PDF, for example, is a format that you can share your files in. And then you can package up the exploded state with that 3D file so that the person that then views it can unexplode or explode your assembly depending on what they want to view within the assembly. So let's do that first. This isn't strictly part of animation, but we have to kind of do this before we can insert our explodes into our animation. I'm just reading the chat. The chat's sort of going, yeah, sorry, still no code, people. It's not for want of trying. So just animation 1. How do you get into the animation tab? So to get into the animation tab initially, you have to go into the applications tab and then just click on animation and it will jump straight into the animations tab. So yeah, let's temporarily jump out of animation or put animation on pause, create our exploded state for this assembly, and then we'll come back in. So we don't have to shut our animation tab down. We can just jump straight into the view tab because that's where we're going to create our exploded state, our exploded view state. And we want to click on manage views. So it's this option here. And then view manager. And this little tool called the view manager pops up. Now, I'm not entirely sure in the assembly that I've shared with you, you may have already in the explode tab within your view manager, explode 1, explode 2, and or explode 3. So if you have, that's good, because those are the explodes that I used initially to create the animation that we looked at first. So let's assume you do have them. And if I want to activate one of these and make this assembly explode, so activate this explode view, I can just double click on it. And then the same with explode 2, I can just double click on that. And the same with explode 3, I can double click on that. But let's assume we have none of these, because if you are looking at these don't come with the assembly. These are ones that I've had to create. The only one that kind of comes with an assembly is this default explode, which in this particular instance hasn't actually exploded the model at all, which is rather odd. Normally what happens is the default explode is the system's interpretation of how those parts should probably be exploded. But in this case, that's not actually working. So let's imagine these are all blank. So we're going to create a new exploded view. So you want to click on new at the top there. We can then give it a name if we want to. So it's prompting me to give it a name there. I'm going to accept the default name. I'm just going to call it Explode 4. So if I press enter, so Explode 4 is now active, but I've not told the system where I want the parts to be in Explode 4. So that's what we're going to do next. I think people are having issues with the remote desktop, which I'll help if I can, but yeah, I'm not I'm not sure how much use. How do you get into the animation tab? Yeah, I think I just covered that. Yeah, the notice that you get on the remote desktop, I was getting that notice earlier that says something about access issues. I think you can just close that pop-up. I wasn't seeing that it was causing any problems at all. The only one that you have to set on the remote desktop is to give it a temp file, a temp folder that it can write its temporary files into. And it asks you to do that, I think, as soon as you come into Creo. It says you do not have access to write to C temp, which is just on the C drive. So what I normally do is I point it at my space on the network and just point it there. I've actually created a little folder in there that I've called temp, and I just point it at that folder. But all those other pop-ups that you get on the remote desktop about retrieval of files and things like that, I normally just cancel the pop-up and just say close or whatever the cancel command is in there. And it doesn't seem to affect anything untowardly. I was able to run all of these sort of activities that we're going through now. I believe it's actually linked to, as Creo is used, it records something that's known as a trail file, which is basically a sort of trail of every operation that you've done in Creo. If you wanted to, at some point, replay that. And I believe it's that it can't write onto the disk. But as long as you don't have a system crash, you should be fine, just cancelling those. So back to what we were doing. So we've created our new explode state. We've left it with the default name. In my case, it's called Explode 4. If you're not seeing 1, 2, and 3, yours will obviously be called 1. Now we're going to edit the positions of the parts within Explode 4. So I'm going to click on Edit, and I'm going to go down to Edit Position. So this is X, Y, Z position of the parts within the assembly. So Edit Position, and then I can just click on a part, and I get these drag handles in the X, Y, and Z directions, just like when we create an assembly itself and we bring a new part in. We get those drag handles that we can drag the part around in X, Y, and Z. So it's very similar when we're in these explode states. So I've dragged that part out there. I'm going to then click on this one and drag that out. I actually initially want a camera angle, which is kind of more like this, where this is the orientation that this part, this motor, would be held in if it was actually fitted within the desk fan, I think, or it may be that direction actually, now that I say it. So these desk fans tend to have a little peg at the top, and I think if you pull the peg up, the fan oscillates backwards and forwards, and then if you push the peg back in again, it fixes it normally. But let's assume that those two little sort of cylindrical shapes should be pointing broadly downwards. So I'm going to plump for a view which is kind of like that. You don't have to get yours exactly the same. But the reason I'm kind of worrying about that is that depending on my viewpoint, I may want to drag some of the parts a bit further out or not as far. But the ultimate aim when you're creating an exploded view is that you can see clear space between each part. So as a general rule, you don't want to have parts overlapping like that. And that is obviously governed in conjunction with the viewpoint that you're viewing the assembly from. So if you view it from a certain angle, let's say that sort of crazy angle, you'd struggle to get the parts far enough away from each other that they weren't overlapping visually. So you've got to kind of consider the two in conjunction with each other. So that sort of angle is okay for me. So I'm going to try and ensure that all these parts have a little bit of free space between each one. So we'll drag that one there. We'll drag this one back out there. And then I think I might take that one forward. So that's reasonable. And then this little peg at the bottom, I can drag that downwards like that. So let's say I'm broadly happy with that now. So I click on OK at that point. And here's the key step that's very easy to miss. Even I missed it earlier on because it's been a little while since I produced exploded views using Creo. Is if I just quit out of the view manager now, all that work that I've just done to set the positions of those is lost. It's gone. So in order to retain it, you've got to click on the edit menu and click save there. It's very easy to miss. I think, in my opinion, they could have designed that a little bit easier. So click on save, and then we get this little pop-up. Now, what this is asking is, what do you want to save in this explode 0004? Do you just want to save the actual positions of the parts, which is what it's going to do at the moment? Or do you want to save the positions of the parts and the orientation of the camera as well? Now, it would be perfectly valid to say, I want to save both. And if I was creating a drawing, say, it would be sensible to save both. Because then when I call this exploded viewing onto the drawing, I would specify that I want the position of the parts called in their exploded positions. And I also want the position of the camera replicated on my drawing as well. But for our purposes, we want to produce an animation where the orientation of the camera is not always linked to the exploded state of our part. So we want the ability to vary the two of them separately to each other within our animation. So all I'm going to save is just the exploded positions of the parts. So I just want to tick that bottom one. Click on OK, and it saved it. And if I want to test that, I can right click on it and say untick explode, and it will go back to its unexploded state. And then right click on explode again, click on explode. So yeah, it's saved the positions. So now we can close the view manager down and we can jump back into our animation tab, which is still open. We didn't have to close the animation tab down. We just sort of temporarily paused what we were doing in there and went into the view tab and created our exploded states. So back into the animation tab. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to, where is it? I've lost it now. I'm going to create a keyframe sequence. So as I said right back at the start, these keyframe sequences allow you to slot in certain events within the timeline and specify certain states that are active at certain points in the timeline, and then the system will fill in the intervening animation to get from one state to the next state. So what I'm going to do first, I want my animation to begin with the assembly fully assembled in its finished form. I don't want to start with it exploded, so I want to select unexploded, which is what it already had selected there. I want to insert this keyframe event at 0 seconds. So I'm broadly happy with all of that. So I'm going to click on plus, and you will see it gets inserted on my timeline sort of graphic at the top there at 0 seconds. And then, as I said before, it's advantageous to have little pauses between any motion that occurs in your animation. So with that in mind, I'm going to put a second unexploded state in at 2 seconds. So it will sit there between 0 and 2 and do nothing at all. It won't start exploding. it will still be unexploded. So I'll click again. You can see it doesn't have to do any work between those two because nothing's happening. But I have to specify that I want that to last until 2, and then I'm going to instigate my explode command over the next few seconds. So next I want to put my explode 4 that I just created, and I'll drop this in at the timeline so we don't have to make the decisions as to where on the timeline these things are exactly at this point, because what we can do later on, we can just drag or click and drag these events to wherever we require them. So as long as they're in the correct order at this point, that's good enough. We don't have to be too precious about exactly where we're dropping them. So let's drop this one at 7. So explode 4 will be complete by 7 seconds. So click on OK, and there you go. So let's have a little look at what we've got. So whenever we make a change to our animation, we have to let the system recalculate or regenerate what the intervening frames of animation are going to look like. It doesn't auto-update when we make a change. And the way that we calculate that or generate the animation is that big sort of play icon in the center there. And then it will run through. So this isn't in real time. It was running through relatively quick there. So it just calculates it as quick as possible on the given machine that you're using. But if I want to now play back what I've got, I have to go from create mode, which is what we've been in so far, where we can add new keyframes or move keyframes around or add new sequences in, to playback mode, which just allows you to play back at the real speed or real frames per second, the animation itself. So I get my kind of play and fast forward and rewind controls here. So I'm just going to click on the play icon there. And this is what I'll see if I render out or if I save out an AVI file or an MPEG file. That would be the speed that it would run at. So it's good to come in here and just appreciate, is that thing happening a little bit too slow? Is it a little bit too fast? Does it happen a little bit early? And you can see I've got the loop option on here, so it just keeps going back to the start. So let's say I'm broadly happy with that as it is at the moment. But I am going to do other changes. I'm going to make it come back together eventually. But let's say at this point, I'm reasonably happy with how that's looking. Someone's just asking why we're using Creo. It's so non-intuitive. There's a small part of me that agrees with that as well. I'm a Creo and SolidWorks user and occasionally Inventor as well. And yeah, Creo does take some time to get used to. And unfortunately, if you're sort of spanning 2 CAD systems, as I do, often a lot of the logic that is put into designing CAD systems such as SolidWorks or in some cases Inventor, Creo kind of has its own take on everything. So yeah, it can be difficult to work in twin CAD systems at the same time. So I do have some sympathy with that. But anyway, back to what we were doing. So ultimately, what we were trying to do was replicate that animation that I was showing you at the top of the session. So I've just activated my animation 1 here, just to kind of review what we've got. And you can see there's lots of events occurring along the timeline here in that original animation. And the overall length of that original animation was 40 seconds. So what we're going to do now is in our animation that we're working on, we're going to extend the timeline up to 40 seconds because the default when you come in to create an animation in Creo is only 10 seconds. So you can see that there at the end of the timeline. So if I want to change that, I can just overtype with whatever I want it to be. So 40 seconds, you can see that my explode sequence has rescaled itself because obviously I've kind of zoomed out on the timeline now. So that entire length across the screen there is now 40 seconds. And I think just for sort of completeness, I'll edit this keyframe sequence and I'll make it come back together. I'm not entirely sure when I'm going to make that happen in the final animation, but I want to at least insert it on this keyframe sequence. So I've got it there and I can kind of slide it around as I see fit when I start to add other things into this animation. So in order to do that, I select the keyframe sequence by clicking on it there, clicking on the keyframe sequence timeline, right click, click on edit keyframe sequence. You can see a little summary of what's going on there at the moment. It's unexploded, and then it's still unexploded, and then it explodes at 7 seconds. So I'm going to add another one in here. I'm going to go unexploded at, let's add it in at 20 seconds. And then I'm going to click on plus, and it should get added in there. So yeah, so I've done that initial transition from assembled assembly, if you like, or together assembly unexploded to explode, and then back to unexploded again. I think what I'll do, because, well, let's have a look at the effect of what we've just done. So I'll click on OK. I'll do a regenerate. It then gives me a little warning saying you've just generated some results. Do you want to overwrite them? Yes, we do. So it explodes, but then there's no pause there in its unexploded state. That is what I was trying to illustrate there. It's sort of, it gets to its fully exploded state and then it instantly starts to come back together. And that's because we haven't put a second instance of that exploded state anywhere on the timeline. So this is what we had to do at the start. We had to put twin unexploded events in order to hold it in its unexploded state and then begin transitioning to exploded. We have to do a similar thing here to hold it in its fully exploded state to a certain point and then allow it to come back together again. So let's drop back into that keyframe sequence, edit it again, tell it that we want to hold it at explode 4, and let's slot it in somewhere after this one. So 10 seconds for the time being will be absolutely fine. And then one last thing that I'm going to do in here, I'm going to switch these translation events. So when it says translation, it just means the position of things has changed in either X, Y, or Z. And currently what it's doing is it's moving the items at a constant speed or a constant velocity. As they move away from each other and begin exploding, they move at the same speed throughout the animation, which that's okay, but you can sort of add another sort of slight level of realism by having the motion gradually increase in its speed. So sort of accelerate initially, and then as things come back together, you can have it slow down again at the end, which is a more kind of realistic motion that you kind of witness a lot, even though you don't realize it in reality. So it just adds another sort of element of realism to the movement within the animation itself. So we're going to switch from linear translation to smooth, and it's going to do exactly what I said. We don't have any rotations in this particular animation, so we don't really have to switch that across. And then I'll just check that that's been applied to all these translation elements. It has. So I'll click on OK. We'll do a regenerate. Goes apart, comes back together. Yeah, I'm largely happy with that, although I am going to play with the position of these particular events once I've sort of developed this animation a little bit further. So we've put an exploded sequence in. Now let's tackle the actual camera angle that we're viewing the thing from. Because again, if we kind of flick back to the original animation that we were kind of looking at to begin with, It begins looking at the thing from one angle, it explodes, and then it begins to transition to a slightly different angle. So it would be nice to kind of be able to replicate that behavior in our animation as well. So back to what we were doing. And again, we have to temporarily sort of jump out of creating our animation in order to set up some camera angles. And the tool that we use to do that is the same tool that we use to create the exploded views. It's the View Manager tool. So if we go back to the View Manager, where are we? View, Manage Views. In the View Manager, at this point, we're not interested in defining any more explodes. It's the orientation of the camera. So orient the view. And then we have various views in here. Again, I think the assembly that I've shared with you has these pre-made views, this view 1 and view 2. It may or may not, but we're not going to use them. We're going to create our own anyway. But you can see if it does have them, or if not, just watch what's happening on my screen. I activate these views, these various views, just by double-clicking on them. And then the camera transitions round to the direction that view's been set up with. So in order to create a new view, all we do is move our camera into the position that we want, just in the normal way that we kind of navigate around our parts and assemblies, just holding the middle mouse button and kind of rotating to the angle that we require. So I'm going to get an angle something like that, and then click on New. A new view will be created there. I can name the view if I want. I might name it, so this is going to be the starting view, so I might name it Start, press Enter. And then again, we have to save what we just done. So you go to the Edit menu at the top, click on Save, and ooh, no you don't. Wow, they've updated that. Amazing. Haha, yes, they have updated that. So you used to have to go in there and press save like you do on the Explode, but it looks like it auto saves now, which is a real one less headache. So the way I'm testing that is I'm just double clicking on some of the default views, the front, left, right, just to see that if when I click back on my view that I've just created, it does in actual fact go back to the orientation that I wanted. So that was a little test just to check that it had actually auto-saved that view orientation. And it did, which is a good thing. So let's just have a little look in there. I think I know what it's done. We'll test that in a second. Sorry, what I'm considering there is I think when it auto-saves that view, it's actually auto-saved the Explode as well within Start. But we'll check that. We'll use Start in our animation as a view direction, and if it instantly calls up the exploded state, we'll know that it has actually saved that as part of the view that it's named Start. But let's create a second view. Let's have the second view again emulate something that happened on that first animation, which is I think it's sort of rotated round slightly to more of a view direction like that, which is just intended to, it's kind of the opposite isometric almost. It's not the total opposite round the other side like this. But the reason that it starts here and then ends there is that I know that within the intervening frames, the model, if you like, will have to rotate, which kind of gives the viewer more of a sense of what these 3D objects are shaped like. If you can view it from several different angles, you get more of an appreciation of the actual form and the shape and the size of all the things contained within the assembly. So I think I'll have my second view something like that. So I'm going to create a new view. I might call this second. And then we'll run with those two, but we will come back in and create a few more. But we'll get those two working first in our animation. So I'm going to close. I'm going to jump back into my animation tab. And in order to instigate a new keyframe sequence where we can jump between one view orientation and the next view orientation, there's actually a specific button for that, view at time, which is essentially all we're trying to do. We're trying to activate a view at a certain time in the timeline. So view at time. What do we want to do first? We want to start at our view that we named start. So you can see that in the drop-down list. So we want to start there at 0 seconds, apply, and you can see it's already started to build this keyframe sequence for us. So again, my intention is to hold it on that view for a second or two. So I want start again at 2 seconds, or maybe 3 seconds. Let's hold it there for 3 seconds. So apply. So it's holding steady. Then I want to start it transition into this other view. So I don't want the start view. I want that view that I called second now. And I want to let it transition to that relatively slowly. So let's give it until 12 seconds. And then apply. And again, you can see it building these things up on the sort of graphical representation of our timeline there. And again, I'm going to hold it on this view for a period of time. So I've still got seconds selected there. Let's hold it until 14. Apply again. And then do we want to go back to the original? I think we'll leave this timeline there because my intention is to then create a third and maybe fourth viewpoint and put those into this timeline as well. But for the time being, those are okay. So let's close that down, do a regenerate. Yes, yes. And then I can stop the regenerate because we've got no more data there. And then maybe have a little playback because there was something I spotted there. So a lot of this is open to interpretation in terms of the things that I'm going to critique about this next. So I think that view transition starts a little bit early. I'd like it to sit in its original position a little bit longer, or maybe try and separate out the movement of the camera, as I said earlier, from the movement of the actual explode sequence. So what I'm trying to provide you here is a little bit of how do you technically use the system, and then how do you create arguably a slightly better animation, better being an interpretive term, obviously. So yeah, let's go back into create there, and let's move the point at which it starts playing with the camera so that it doesn't overlap quite as much with that explode, because between those 2 points there, the thing is exploding, the assembly is exploding. So I think it's advantageous to keep the camera static until almost the end of that. So it's almost completed and it's just ramping down. Because as I said, the speed with which it explodes starts off relatively slow there, accelerates, gets up to full speed there, and then decelerates. So it's beginning to decelerate over here before this point. And then likewise, we can set our view transition to begin accelerating there. So it's often nice to have a modest overlap, but if everything's happening all at once, it can confuse the eye a little bit. So I think that'll probably be better. What I might do at this point is, if I can right click on there and just edit that. Yeah, I thought there was a ramp in and ramp out option there, but there isn't. It may have ramp in and ramp out or smooth already selected. So let's do a generate. Yes, we want to overwrite the temporary files out, and then it begins to move, and then it starts to come back together. So the next thing that I've spotted is I'd like to hold it in its exploded state for longer, I think. I think that would be better. And again, these are sort of artistic interpretations of what we're seeing here. But as I say, I'm trying to give you a little bit of both in this session. I'm trying to give you the technical skill to use the tools in Creo, but then sort of give you a little bit of advice from some of the things I've learned from creating animations in here, but in other packages as well. So let's hold it in its exploded state. So now what I'm going to do, I'm going to just drag one of these points. So you can see I've selected the keyframe sequence that it's on by clicking on the line. And then if I click and hold on one of the points, I can drag it to a different time on the timeline. So maybe at this point I'll start dragging things out and just using some of that 40 seconds that we've created for ourselves. So from there to there, the view is changing. So I maybe would put a slight overlap there where the viewpoint is changing between these two markers, and then the explode begins to come back together there. So just a bit of an overlap is probably the best thing. Then out, begins to move, holds it there, and then comes back together. That's looking a little bit better. We could still tweak that, but we know how to do that now. It's as easy as selecting things. We can drag them around. We can add new things in. We can refer back to that MPEG file, wherever that one's gone. There it was. Yeah. So let's do something else on this one. Let's create a second explode state to move one component and insert that into here as well. Because that kind of gives you the answer, if you like, as to how do I create this animation specifically for my knife, where I can show things moving on their own. So the majority of the assembly stays where it is, but then portions of it move out and then move back in again, which is just a development of what we've already done using the explode tool. So back into the view tab, back into manage views, view manager. It's a new explode that I'm going to create. So click on the explode tab, new. Do I want to save the modified exploded for first? Yes. Oh, I might wish I didn't do that. No, I don't. I cancelled that. I didn't press yes. So I cancelled saving that. I think what it was doing there is because I'm showing the unexploded state, because I run to a point within my timeline where it's unexploded, and I had exploded 4 still active, which is why it's got a green arrow at the side. The system picked up on that and basically said, the state that you've saved exploded 4 in isn't the state that you're looking at on the screen. Do you want to overwrite exploded 4 with what you're looking at on the screen? So we didn't want to do that because we were happy with how exploded 4 looked when we pressed save when we were creating it. So now I'm creating a new one, which is exploded 5. Just let me get back into the chart. Please, can you complete the orient step? Yeah, we'll go back and do the orient step again. Mine doesn't explode during the animation. Ah, that's interesting. Okay, well, we'll cover a few more of these. So let me do the explode one for Sam specifically, although everyone else will want to create this second explode as well. So I'm creating a new explode. I've clicked on new. It's given it the next default name, which is 5. I'm pressing enter now to accept the name. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab just 2 components and I'm going to make them explode outwards out of the front of this assembly. So I'm going to click on edit position. I'm going to select that component, and then I'm going to hold down control and select that component. And then when I drag, the 2 are fixed together. So the 2 are coming at the same time. So drag that out to a distance. If I'm happy with that, click on OK, and then click on save. Yeah. So I've got that as a new explode. So I've got explode 4, which is that original one that I did, and I've got explode 6, which if I want to unexplode and explode it just to check what it looks like, yeah, that looks good. So let me just drop that back into the animation. So I'm going back into the animation tab. I'm going to put a keyframe sequence in. I'm going to go unexploded somewhere in this range over here. So the upper 20s, I would say, or maybe the mid 20s, somewhere there. So let's say about 27. I want it unexploded, so that's fine. Add that in. Why did that put that in at 0? We'll play with that later on. So explode 5. I'll drop that in 4 seconds after the original. And then back to unexploded again. A little bit after exploded 5. So there. And I'm going to switch them all to smooth. And then I'm going to drag these into the positions that I want them in on my timeline. So, like that. Let's see what that looks like. So we'll do a regenerate. So it'll go through all this original stuff that we created, the camera transitions, the coming back together, and then it will just simply do a move these two components out and move them back in again. So yeah, let me address some of the problems then that people are having. So it doesn't explode during the animation. So Sam specifically, did that, what I just did there, did that solve your problem? Because I kind of put a second explode in my animation there. Were you able to follow that?
Yeah, it exploded originally, but as soon as I put in the like camera movement, it just, I don't know if I've not ticked something, but it just doesn't sort of explode while it's doing the camera movement.
Right. Well, let's try and do a quick little troubleshoot of that. So if you go into View and go into View Manager, make sure you're on the Explode tab. If you double click on the one that you created first, so in my instance it was that number 4, does it jump everything to their correct locations, or have they all been sort of brought back together?
They're all back together.
Yeah. Yeah, you dropped into that sort of trap that I narrowly avoided there, where it was, I think what it was doing, it was trying to offer me the option of overwriting the positions that I'd moved them into with their current positions. And in my case, their current positions were unexploded. So yeah, unfortunately, it's lost yours. But you should be able to, if you activate that explode. So let me, yeah, mine's active. So activate it, edit position, drag them back out again, click on OK, click on save, and then make sure you have that bottom box ticked. And it should reinstate them again. But yeah, unfortunately, overwrote yours. The orientation step, I think someone else was asking about. So let's create another view orientation. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to refer back to that original animation that we were looking at. And I'm just going to have a look at some of the other kind of camera angles that are used in there. So we have broadly the one that we start on as well. And then it transitions around, so it's looking sort of very much from what I'd consider the back of the part. I'm going to have to do another rebuild on this, or another regen. Just give me a sec. So there's a view in there where it's looking more from the back, which we haven't got one that sort of emulates that. And then there's a roll to it, so there's a kind of rotation and movement as well. So let's try and create a new view that kind of emulates what we were seeing, where it was looking kind of more from this kind of angle. So what I'm going to do, in the View tab again, going back into View Manager, click on the Orient tab, click on new, and I'll call this one third. So this is the one that I'm intending to go to third. And then I'll modify the direction that I want to kind of capture. So like that. I'll check that it's logged that view. So I'll go to the second and then come back to third again. It hadn't. This is the bit that often trips me up even. So save. I don't want to save the explode state. It's not saving it for some reason. That's ooh. I think I've dropped into a heffalump trap here. What happens if I create a new view and call it fourth? Fourth G. Yeah. Very odd. Save. But I don't want to save the... I think it's because I've got an explode active. Yes. Yeah, so I'm getting to the bottom of this. So I think what it's trying to do, it's trying to unify the exploded state with the orientation of the camera at the same time. And for our purposes for the animation, we specifically want to keep them separate from each other. We don't want the two to be activated. For example, when we call up an explode state, we don't instantly want the camera to change its sort of viewpoint. We want to have the two separated from each other. But the default for the system is to try and unify the two into a sort of single saved view. So if I try and separate these two now, so I don't want the explode. Let's save that, but don't save the orientation. And then we'll go to the orientation. Still not working. But the fourth is working. That's very odd. So let's jump back into the animation and see what we've got. And then we'll come back out and nitpick through this and try and figure out. So what I want to do, I want to add my other views that I've created into the viewpoint timeline here. So I've got that initial view, that start. Then I've got the second view. So I want to add something else in. So in order to do that, I have to select one of the existing steps, go to edit, pick one of my other views. So in my case, I'm going to pick fourth, and then I'm going to drop it in a little bit later on. So maybe at 20, like that. And then let's see what that's going to look like. So we're transitioning round. And then I think it's still bringing the explode in. This may be one that I'm going to have to play with. But my friend earlier on that was saying, this is very non-user friendly. I sympathize with you greatly because I often use a package. I either use animation in SolidWorks, which is a lot more user friendly than this, or a rendering package known as Keyshot, which again is quite user friendly in comparison. But anyway, leave that with me and I'll debug that a little bit more for us. But the last sort of behavior that we wanted to insert into our animations was we wanted to affect the actual transparency of the parts themselves, which again has a specific button in the same way that we use the view at time. There's a transparency at time as well that just behaves in exactly the same way. You click it, it then basically is asking you a question, which it, again is not immediately obvious, but this is a clue. this little select window saying select one or more items. So let's say in this instance, it's the outer housing that we want to make slightly transparent so that you can see through the outer case and see some of the details inside. So what we would do is click on that half of the housing, hold down Control, click on that half of the housing. When we've got everything selected that we want, click on OK there, and it will accept that. And then as we move this slider around now, you can see we're having an effect on those two components. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to say I want to save a transparency state which is fully opaque first, because initially in this animation I don't want any transparency. I want it to transition to semi-transparent at some point. So I'm going to leave it on opaque. I want to add that in at 0 seconds. You can see it's created a new keyframe sequence up there. It's put transparency 1 on. Then I'm going to pick those two components again. So I held down Control there to pick the two components. Click on OK. And then slide it to something where it's not fully transparent, but sort of semi-transparent, like that. And then I can insert that. And again, exactly where I insert these events on the timeline isn't critical at this point, because you can, once you've created them and you've created the order that you want them to occur in, so that's the critical bit, that you get them in the correct order, you can actually drag their position around on the timeline to suit what you want your animation to look like. So let's insert one of these. What's a reasonable time frame to have this occur over? Let's insert it initially over 5 seconds. And then let's put one more in so they go back to fully opaque again. So select the two components that I want to affect by holding Control, selecting the two components, click on OK when I've selected them. I've got them back at opaque, and I want to put this in after the one that I've just entered, so I'm going to drop it in at 10 seconds, apply, and what's going to happen there is it's going to start opaque, it's going to transition through to my transparency setting that I set, and then it's going to come back to opaque again. So let's quit out of there, and let's put this somewhere in the timeline where we can sort of assess it a little bit more. Let's put it over here at this end of the timeline. So I'm just clicking and dragging again. And then I'll drag him a little bit closer to there. Something like that. This is just a holding position, just so that we can see what's actually happening. So went transparent, became opaque again. So was there anything else on our initial animation that happened there? I don't think there was. Let's just run it through one last time. So we have an explode, we have a camera movement, we have a transparency that then stays semi-transparent for the majority of this sort of section of the animation. And then as things come back together, then they begin to become opaque again. So they're turning opaque gradually. So that transparency arguably looks best when it's sort of running slowly in the background. But again, we could kind of achieve that quite easily by adding the events in, dragging them around on the timeline a little bit, and sort of replicating that. I'm just reading the chat a little bit. Yeah, let's have a look at outputting stuff. When we've kind of played around with these tools to the point where we're reasonably happy and we'd like to actually save out the animation, the steps that you have to do to achieve that. So let me jump back into the one that we were doing. The first step would be you have to regenerate it. So do a regenerate, make sure that you've got everything recalculated and reinterpolated on your timeline. Then you go into playback mode when that's completed. So into playback mode, you might take one last look at it just to check that it's doing what you think it is supposed to do. And then it's that icon there. So often when I get things handed in at the end, people have just done screen grabs and things. They can't figure out how to output these things. But that's the output that you're hoping to create by all these other steps. So record the animation. And to be honest, if you want the highest kind of quality, I would do it as an AVI and I would do it as uncompressed. But if you're using the remote desktop, you are limited in your disk space, I believe. So there are methods to get around that. You can send a polite little email to IT and tell them that you're on an engineering style course and that you require extra storage on the network. And I think they increase it to something quite generous. I think it's at least a few gigabytes. So that would be my sort of steer. Save it as an AVI originally. You can set the resolution that you're saving it at there, which is kind of governed by the aspect ratio of your little viewport here. So if I wanted something that was super, super widescreen, I could drag this all the way out. And if I wanted to go to the other extreme, I'd get something that was almost square if I tried to save out there. So back into that, give it a resolution, something there. You can set the number of frames per second, and again, it will interpolate the kind of missing frames. And then browse and tell it where you'd like to actually save to. So mine, I think, is going to save into the working directory by default. And then give it a name. And then when you click on OK, it will run through. You can see it running through in the background, and it's saving that AVI file. The slightly annoying thing that I kind of came up against earlier is if you're using the virtual desktop again, there's no inbuilt media player on the virtual desktop version of Windows, which is somewhat of an oversight. But I suppose the logic behind that is that it's known as the engineering desktop. And the logic is you won't need a media player if you're doing pure engineering on it. So what you'll have to do is you have to save out that AVI file. You'll then have to transmit it to yourself on your local machine, either via email or upload it to something like OneDrive or Google Drive or something. And then you'll download it on your local machine where hopefully you'll have a media player of some description. So either the built-in Windows media player will play these files, or something like VLC player will play them as well. And then for transmitting them, you'll see if you've saved a big AVI file or you've saved an uncompressed AVI file, the size of that file will be rather large in megabytes or possibly gigabytes. So if you want to optimize that, you could just simply upload it to YouTube, but the upload time will take a long time. So you want to download something which will convert it to a compressed format. And as I say, my recommendation would be a program called Handbrake, which is free. You can download it and you throw your AVI file in it and it will output something like a MP4 file, which is highly compressed. So yeah, that's kind of that side of it. But before we run out of time, I want to have a little look at the rendering tools within Creo as well. So if you want a little bit more on the animation side of things, I have kind of already covered this in one of the general Creo tutorial videos, which should be available in there. Let's just have a little look. Hopefully it's on the end of this list. Yep, there it is. So that particular example, I kind of run through it again in this video here. So you've always got that to sort of dip into. And I'm gonna go away because I want to know why I can't unlink, orient, and explode there. I think I'm just missing a final step because I don't use the animation tools within Creo that often. So I'll go away, I'll find out how you decouple the explode views and the orient views from each other, and I'll feed that back to you. But this video is pretty good, and the output of that video is what we were looking at the top of the session. So that one does work. So if you wanted to follow these steps exactly in that video, you should get the output that you require. But yeah, I'll go away and do a bit more digging on why we were having that issue, and some people were having the same issue, I think, where it was sort of trying to fold the orientation of the camera and the exploded view into a single save, which is not what we wanted at all. So let's jump through into rendering instead. So I'm going to close the animation tab down now. So let's assume I've saved that out to disk. I'm happy with it. Then what it's going to say to me, it's going to say you have to take a specific save of your Creo file after you've created the animation so that you save these animations with the overall assembly. Do you want to do that? Yeah, we do. And then it saves it out in the working directory, but with one of these PBA extensions. So that's that saved. So I've quit out of the animation portion of Creo. Now we're going to drop into the rendering side of Creo, or the Render Studio. So we're back in the Applications tab. Generally, this Applications tab gives you access to all the tools that are really considered add-ons to the core Creo kind of tools, which are the core tools are there for creating parts and assemblies and manipulation of those parts and assemblies. So creating things like views and adding annotations to them and things like that, and using simple analysis tools like measurement tools and weights and measures and things like that. Everything that's included in the Applications tab are sort of add-ons or plugins for Creo that, depending on what license for Creo you're working with, you'll have more of these included or less of them included. But the one that we're going to drop into is Rendering Studio. So we're going to use this same model initially. If we get the time, we may download some of the other content that I've provided as well. But we'll use this one as a starting point. So click on Render Studio, and then it will drop you into the Render Studio tab, and you'll see instantly it's changed the visual appearance in my graphics window there. So I'm no longer using the graphics card in the PC that I was using to visualize the part. I'm now 100% on the CPU. And if you run this on your local machine, you'll probably notice the fan in the machine goes a bit crazy. It goes to 100%. And that's because what's happening here is the image that we're seeing on the screen is constantly refining itself. So it's calculating what this part should look like with virtual light rays bouncing off it. So there's a virtual sort of environment around this part now, and the light from that environment is hitting the part, and the system's constantly calculating what we would see if we were viewing the part. So we're doing ray tracing essentially. So yeah, it's constantly refining the image. So whenever I move this, it goes very blocky, and then as soon as I let it sit for a minute, you can see, certainly in the shadow area here, it's gradually refining and refining and refining and refining. And if we want to get a sense of that, if you click where it says real-time rendering, there's a drop-down button, and click on scene information, this is what it's doing in the background. So on my machine, around 25 frames every second, or 25 times every second, it's refining the image. It's making it slightly better. And how many times it's refined it is referred to as samples. And you can see the samples just keep climbing and climbing and climbing and climbing. And that's its behavior. So it's a real-time rendering system, which is kind of the norm these days. But in the sort of not too distant past, you would work with a sort of viewport that looked very much like our standard viewport, like this. And you'd try and set up your materials and lighting, and then there'd be a render button at the top, and you'd press render, and you'd have to wait. Whereas modern systems have kind of all gone to this real-time rendering, where you only have to stop rotating the camera, and the image gradually gets better and better and better and better. So let's have a little play with this. Let's just to add a little bit of interest, because this is quite a boring assembly. It's just sort of a smooth outer shell. Let's activate one of our exploded views, because it just makes what we're looking at a little bit more interesting. So I'm going to jump into the View tab. I'm going to go into my Manage Views and View Manager, and I'm going to pick one of the explodes in there. So that one will do for these purposes. So I just double clicked on it to activate it. Then I'm going to jump back into the Render Studio tab. So back into the Render Studio, you can see it keeps that exploded view. And then I think the first thing I'd like to do, the scene that is lighting this and the background are not terribly interesting, and they're not picking up any of the sort of highlights or shadows on these parts very well. So I'd like to change the scene that is used to light everything, but is also shown in the background as well. And there's a library of these scenes inside Creo. And if you click on scenes at the top there, you can scroll up and down, see some various options. I think, let's have a look at that one there. So I'm going to double click on this to activate it. And it will activate it in a second. So the two things have happened there. Number one, the background image has changed. So superficially, this looks as if it's kind of in a room that's got wooden floorboards. But, and you may not have noticed this as much, the actual lighting on our part itself has changed as well. So certainly on this back portion here, that sort of shadow that's being cast across gives us a much sort of greater understanding of the shape of the internal of this molded part here. So it's picking up a lot of the kind of shape and form of that part a lot more sort of efficiently, or it's giving the viewer a lot more data about what that shape of that injection molded part is. And the reason that it's done that is, so if I hover over one of these, so I'm going to hover over that one for a second. If you read the little tooltip there, it says indoor room scene lit by a HDR image. And the key bit there is HDR. So these images aren't just pictures like a JPEG or a bitmap file or a PNG. These images are captured using multiple camera exposures, which means that the lights that were in the room at the time that the image was captured, their values have also been captured as well. And the upshot of that is the rendering system can use the lights that were in the room when the multiple exposures were captured to light your 3D product. So it's using that background image to actually cast light on this 3D product, which, again, to give you a bit of history of it, that was not always the case. But inevitably, a lot of the computer-generated imagery that you see in product promotion, like cars, for example, or cosmetic products, it's all CGI images. And they use these HDR images to provide realistic lighting onto their 3D models of their car or of their cosmetic products or of their sports products. So that's what it's doing in the background. And we get access to this library of various HDRs. So I've just activated a different one. The lighting's changed slightly again. But if we want to make more changes in here, we can. We don't just have to call them up out of the library, because the library that's available with Creo is pretty modest. I think there's about 8 or 10 different environments. So I'm just clicking through some of them now. And some of them are arguably more realistic than others. So let's activate that one, the desert. Yeah. So let's edit one of these. So if we go into edit scene, these things are made up of, I've already talked about the environment. So there's a HDR image in the background of this scene in particular. And the HDR image is mapped onto a huge sphere. So if I zoom out a bit and rotate around my part, you get a sense that this environment's been captured in 360 degrees. So you can sort of sense that. And whilst my part's not actually sat in that environment, there are certain angles and certain environments and certain parts where if you get the angle just right, you can make something appear as if it is actually in the environment. That's not a very good example. But again, these things take a lot of sort of time tweaking the settings to get the desired effect, whereas we're just, in this particular one, learning a little bit about the tools that are available to us. So there's various things that we can do to this environment. We can sort of turn all the light values up or reduce the light values down in this environment. And that would be the intensity slider here. So if I drop that down to half its initial value, so 0.5, the environment will get darker. You can see the effect it had on the lighting that is illuminating my part as well. So not only has the background got darker, the amount of light that's been cast onto my product has also decreased. So let's bump it up to 1.5 now. And again, you can see the effect it's having on the actual 3D model itself, as well as affecting the background. Other things that we can do with the environment. Often when I'm doing rendering such as this in this package or other packages, I won't want to use the HDR image as my background, because there are sort of better ways of presenting what appears to be a realistic background image than just using the HDR. So what I might do is say background, and I can bring a static image in and sort of place it as a card behind my render. So there's certain images that I've shared in this week's downloads. I'm just looking through. So we've got some HDR images there, HDR, HDR, HDR to test. I thought I'd put a background image in there, but I haven't. That's a shame. Backplate, yes. Let's see if we can find some backplate. Yeah, that didn't work. Ah, there's a nice one. So if I was doing an auto rendering, something like that might be a nice one to bring in. But you can load in a JPEG and drop it into the background there. Other options in here, you can have a nice blended color from the top of the screen to the bottom of the screen, which if you click there, you can specify the color at the top of the screen using the color wheel here. So you can see that affecting. And what's going on there, even though the background appears to be different, the HDR image is still there to provide lighting for my scene. But what I'm seeing behind my part as the background, I now have full control over. So I can set a nice little gradient up Often it's nice to have sort of earth tones towards the bottom of the screen and sort of sky tones towards the top of the screen, something like that. So depending on what you're rendering, you might want to use that. As I've already said, you can drop in a JPEG image into the background if you want and use that as your background. You can just have a simple color in the background, but that environment is still providing a lot of the lighting for my scene. So other things that we might want to do. Often you don't want your whites or your blacks or greys in your screen to have this sort of warmness to them. So you can see this white material here is reflecting the deep blue of the sky there. So in my desert HDRI that I'm using to light this scene, the sky is primarily inky sort of blue with the sun in one portion of it. And that's why the top of this white material appears blue. And then the desert itself is this more sort of warm color. So it's got sort of an orangey pinkiness to it. And that's why the underside of this has got that orangey pinkiness, which in some cases might be the exact look that you're going for. But in other cases, maybe creating this warmness and coolness on parts that aren't in reality that color, they're supposed to be, in this case, white, is not wanted. So what you can do in that case is you have a saturation slider here, which is just like the color or saturation on your TV. So if you slide that all the way to the left, it washes out the image. So now the image that's doing the lighting for my scene has gone black and white. So I've removed all the saturation from the image. Or maybe you want something which is a compromise, somewhere in the middle like that. But you have all these tools. And then obviously the sun is, as I've already said, the sun is providing a huge light source for this 3D part. But if I'm not happy which direction the sun's coming in, so you can see I've got a big shadow cast here and I've got various highlights, I can rotate the HDR image around my part, which is, depending on your system, should be possible in real time. But mine's running incredibly slowly today. May have even crashed. Come on. Oh no. I may have to quit out and come back in here. Oh, I think it's died. Oh, no, it's coming back to life again. I think I've just pushed it a bit too far there. Ah, here we go. It's allowed me to shut that down. Oh, no, it hasn't. Yeah, I'll give my system a minute or so to try and wake up from that. But the bottom line with all this is we're pushing the CPU pretty hard with all this. With the real-time rendering that's going on here, or the real-time refinement that's happening, it will, if you let it, max out all the various cores on your CPU. I think the default setting is that it will only use 80% or 75% of the cores in your particular machine, but it's still pretty CPU intensive. So you will hear the fans spool up in the machine. It will slow other things down. If we drop into real-time settings there again, where we switch that scene information on. So this is the control for the rendering engine that's actually rendering our scene. And if we move the scene there and just let it refine for a second or two, we can play around with this. So the reason that I'm mentioning this is you can see there, because I've got an 8-core machine specifically here, it's been set to use just 6 of those cores. So I've still got 2 cores within my PC that can handle other tasks that the PC may be doing. But if I'm only interested in getting these images refined as quickly as possible, I can bump that up to 100%. But I think given that I'm streaming out a Zoom call as well, that's probably not wise on my machine. So other things that we can play with here. the number of ray tracing bouncers that our virtual light source is allowed to fire at our part. We can bump that right up. And if we put it down at its lowest setting, let's try it at 1. Yeah, it doesn't seem to be affecting it too much. But essentially, if you have dark areas on your scene that you want to try casting a bit more light into, before you begin to play with your light sources in your HDR or in the scene itself, it can be useful to come in here and up the number of ray bouncers. Because if we imagine we're a ray of light coming from a light source, hitting the 3D geometry, and then we hit the original piece of 3D geometry and then get bounced off in a different direction, this is the number of bounces that the system will calculate. So often if you increase this value, areas that were previously a little bit dark in your scene can be made to appear a little bit lighter. And generally, as you slide these sliders up from the left to the right, you're increasing the realism of the actual rendered image itself. And there are presets in here. There's a mode called performance mode, which if I switch that on, that was the effect that I was going for earlier. You can see things appear quite basic because the number of ray bounces is minimized, the number of indirect bounces is minimized, the quality of everything's been turned really far down. And that's to enable you to quickly work on your scene without having to wait for things to recalculate or wait for it to render too long. And then generally, as we work down the list here through basic, you can see the quality being turned up here. Product, for the things that we're designing, product is probably as much as you need in terms of the settings. But there are things to do with using this system to generate interiors of buildings. So when you're lighting interiors of buildings, you don't have the luxury normally of having much environmental light that can get into that enclosed space. So the analogy would be if we unexploded this assembly and then we placed our camera inside the actual, let's say, this molding itself, there wouldn't be a huge amount of light that could get in there from the external lighting environment. So you have to switch on interior mode, and it uses a slightly different rendering engine, but it slows everything down. So we probably wouldn't use that. Even though it's more accurate, more physically accurate, it does slow everything down. And we're kind of designing things that are intended to be viewed from the outside. So it's not like a building. So let's play with some of the other options. Let's apply some materials, because there's kind of a few inputs that create a good render. There's a good 3D model, which is a 3D model that's realistic, that looks like the actual thing that it's meant to be a representation of. So that's a good starting point. There's good quality materials. So we're about to tackle this, and Creo calls them appearances, but this is the actual appearance of each piece of each part. What are they made out of? Are they a shiny plastic? Are they a brushed metal? Are they semi-transparent plastic or glass? What are they made out of? Can we accurately replicate that within our rendering system? So materials or appearances. And then the third one is, what is our scene that's lighting the model, that is creating the actual light rays that are bouncing off our model? And a combination of those three is how you're going to get a more realistic output as a render. So let's address the appearances one. So let's start applying some appearances to our part. So I'm clicking on appearances. I'm going to delve into the Creo library of pre-made appearances as a good starting point. And I'm going to go into, I think, plastics first. So you can see plastics. And I'd like some sort of frosted plastic, I think, for these end sections. and I'm going to initially make it just so you can see it's called up these frosted plastic colours. I can then go in and edit these after I've applied them, but initially I'm just going to apply the clear one at this side. So click on that, and then the system's asking me a question. It's saying select something to apply this to. So I'm going to apply it to that part there, hold down Control, and apply it to that part there as well, and then click on OK. And you can see that's radically changed the appearance of those two parts. So let's keep going. Let's apply some more appearances. So I want to get access to the metals in the Creo library. So I'm going to drop into metals. I think I'll have some form of aluminium. And then if I hover over these, I get a little pop-up telling me what they are. I'd like some sort of brushed... it's the first one there. So brushed aluminium is what I want next. Click on that. And I'd like to apply it to this kind of little bracket part here. So click on it to select it. Click on OK. And it applies the brushed aluminium material. So we'll keep going. We'll put a few more in here. Let's have another plastic, and let's have injected and black, and I'd like to apply it to that part there. And then at that point, I think the black that it's selected is sort of the deepest black available, and I'd like to sort of lighten that up slightly. So if we want to make an edit to a material that's already in our scene, if we go to the appearances drop down, you can see the materials listed there that are in our scene already. So that's what's being used. I select the one that I want to make a change of, and then go down to Edit Model Appearances. Make sure that I have actually got that one selected. And then I've already said the base color, I want to increase the brightness of slightly. I don't want it the blackest black that's available in the system. I want it just a little bit higher than that. And then we'll have a little play around with some of the other options in here. So the reflection color. So as light rays or images are reflected in this surface, what sort of value should they be reflected at? So a mirror, for example, this value would be set as white because you want it to reflect almost 100%. But I'm going to increase this a little bit. But this is also used in conjunction with the glossiness of the material itself. So if a material is entirely glossy, you kind of get a reflection which has no distortion on it at all. Whereas a entirely unglossy appearance is as if you've taken a relatively rough piece of sandpaper and sanded the surface down. So the reflections are very diffuse. You can't make out much detail in them at all. So you can affect that about the material as well. So let's OK that one because I want to address... So the motor here has a kind of representation of some windings, which I'm assuming are intended to be kind of copper in colour. So let's address this part, because what we want to do here is apply two materials to a single part. And if we try and do that now, so let's call up a metal in copper and pick one of these. So let's pick the copper cast, just for example, and try and apply it to that section there. So what it does is it selects the entire part. And that's because when we were working at the assembly level, we can only apply materials per part. We don't get the luxury of sort of dropping down within the part and defining different areas that we'd like to apply different materials to. So if I just try and do that now, just as an example, I'll click where I think I want it, click on OK, and it applies it to the entire part. And that has been applied within this assembly only. So as if to prove that, I'll right click on the part over here and then open that part in its own window. And you can see its original appearance is retained. So if you want to think about it like this, within the assembly, it's had an appearance applied over the top of its part level appearance. So the assembly appearance kind of trumps or is higher up in the hierarchy than the part level appearance. So I've applied that entire copper appearance to the part within the assembly. So I've wrapped it in that copper appearance. So if I want to achieve what I said I wanted to achieve, I'm going to have to remove this copper appearance within the assembly. So if I want to do that, I go into appearances again, clear appearance, and then click on the part that I want to clear the appearance from. So this one here. And then it clears it. And because it's no longer got an assembly appearance, essentially, it defaults back to the part appearance. The part appearance was always underneath there, but the assembly appearance is higher up in the scene hierarchy. So now, if I open that part up again, like that, now I can apply the appearance within the part itself. So I don't have to be in the rendering mode to apply appearances to parts. So I've temporarily dropped out of the rendering mode because I'm working on this part and I haven't switched the render studio on within this part. But I can still apply materials in the view tab. So in the view tab where we were earlier, where we were using the view manager, there's various other tools in here, and the appearances and scene tools are both available in here as well. So we don't have to instigate the rendering window or the rendering add-on in order to modify the appearances or the scenes. It's just that to get the full effect, we do have to have the rendering studio active. So we only appreciate the full effect of changing these things when we do actually activate the render studio. But we'll apply the copper material to just this section. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to erase the existing appearances. Or maybe I might edit the one. That's probably a better way of going about this. So I already have an orange appearance there. So I could just edit the orange to appear more realistic. I think that's probably the way to go here. So edit model appearances, edit the orange. The orange is currently a type of material just known as a generic, which is not terribly realistic. But if I browse through the list, there's a type of rendering material known as metal, which is probably the best one to go for. And then copper is broadly, that's a little bit too orange, I think. So let's try and come up with a sort of something around that sort of color palette is probably a little bit more realistic. So I think if I drop back into the assembly where I do have the renderer active, so the way I'm flicking between windows here is clicking on that icon at the top. And any open windows that I have in Creo, I can flick backwards and forwards between them. So that's not looking too bad. But if I wanted the luxury of being able to play with that material now, I would jump back into the part and probably instigate the render studio just on this part so that I can then sort of modify the appearance of this in a more sort of fine way. So I could play around with the glossiness of it. You can see the effect when I slide this glossiness slider all the way down to the other side. It's as if the metal's been given a rough surface finish. So maybe like some sort of bead blasting or something like that, or maybe just a sanding operation. And then for the rest of this part, I can apply some other sort of material. So let's have a look. Let's have a steel for the rest of the part. Steel brushed. And then if we select, no, let's select the top level. So we can click on things here in the graphics window, but we can also click on the top level here in the model tree. Yeah. Ooh, that's a bit harsh. So I would want to play with that in terms of edit the model appearance, select the steel brushed. It's actually got something known as a bump map. So you can see bump here. And what it's doing is it's calling a specific image in, which is giving it this kind of really quite harsh brushed finish. So in this case, I don't really want that. So I'm going to switch that off. Or maybe I'd switch it to one of the built-in textures. Maybe rough. Yeah, that's not bad. But I might want to play with the scale of the texture. So the little imperfections in the surface, what sort of size are they? Yeah, something like that might be a little bit more appropriate. And then if I jump back into the motor overall, yeah, it's highly reflective. So the thing that I might want to address next here is that the material that I've added to this outer casing is so reflective that it looks a little bit jarring when it has reflections coming from up above here, where there's a huge light source in my scene. Uh, the jump in sort of color is huge. And you can see that sort of having a really negative effect. So I think we've run out of time. Yeah, it is. It's 4 o'clock. If you want to sort of save that and keep experimenting there, it's a process that's sort of ongoing in terms of honing your rendering setup skills. Uh, it's I've given you the initial tools there to actually sort of make a start in it, but certainly there's a huge amount of kind of artistic interpretation that you only learn by kind of doing these things. But if I was to point you in certain directions to actually appreciate this a little bit more, if you search on the internet or on YouTube for a package called Keyshot, then there are lots of tutorials for their package. And their package, which is a standalone rendering package, is the driving force behind this rendering engine in Creo. So this Creo Render Studio is just a cut down version of Keyshot, the full program. So if you watch some of their tutorials, of which there are thousands of hours, because it's quite a large subject in terms of getting really good quality renders. Yeah, I can recommend all that. And if you happen to download an evaluation copy of Keyshot, you can actually export these scenes that you set up in here as Keyshot files. So you can see that render output, export to Keyshot. One last thing, when you're happy with your scene, don't just take a screenshot of it, because that's sort of the bare minimum way of doing things. Click on the render button, tell the system where you'd like to save your JPEG file or TIFF file or PNG file to, give it a name, give it a resolution that you want to render it out at, and then probably give it a maximum time that you're going to let it sit and render your image for. And you can experiment with this. But certainly for your final images, I would say 10 minutes is not being too generous, really. Yeah, for the simple things that you're going to be rendering. But play around with that by all means, and have a little sort of read about Keyshot. So I think we'll wind this up, and I think we're back in 2 weeks, but check the timetable, and we'll continue on with something else when we all reconvene. But I'll see you next time.